Singer's article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Before we start, I want to say, I sure hope that there's a whole lot of really happy people whose happiness will outweigh. So I'm going to talk about his article by Peter Singer. Peter Singer is he's very famous for being a hardcore consequentialist, a hardcore utilitarian. This article is I've heard, I don't know, I've heard on the Magic Wall or something, that this is the #1 most read article by undergraduate philosophy students in this country. And the reason is it's such a clear, sustained piece of moral argumentation. And the interesting thing is, I think Singer explicitly says that he's trying to not run a utilitarian line. He's trying to argue as much as possible just on a common sense basis. So we'll see how that goes. The point of the argument is just pretty straightforward, I think. One way of putting it is, you, me, are morally obligated to not wear white shirts, clean white shirts, but give away much more of your resources to people who are substantially worse off than you are. Singer puts it slightly differently. We'll get to that. That raises a question, and I'm going to say a few words here that maybe you don't need to hear. Some people definitely do, but I think something does come of it. We can state the point of Singer's article in one sentence from different versions. So why do we have this article here, and why would one want to write a whole article, read a whole article? I think a similar question would be, if you can ace an exam on Macbeth by reading the Cliff's Notes version, why read the play? And I know people in school who actually did better than me on the exams by doing that. The point of Macbeth is not his point. The point of Singer is not his point either. The point of it is not his conclusion, I don't think. Here's why. His conclusion is something that he thinks. That's his opinion. And Singer, just as we all do, has a right to his opinion. But what he doesn't have is a right for us to take it seriously. He's got to do something else. He's got to give us a reason to care about his opinions, and he does that by giving an argument, and that's what the article is. That's the main point of the argument, not the point, but the argument. What an argument ideally does is point out that you need to believe a certain thing on pain of irrationality, and that's what he's going to try to get us to do. One other preliminary here. We ought to note that this conclusion about tightly logically structured argument is a value conclusion. And some people, again, I don't know that people in here fall into this, but some people will say, how can you argue? How can you reason your way to a value conclusion? Values are opinions. You can't reason your way to one. Values are just matters of opinion. How can demonstrations and logic attach to value claims? And the answer is clearly, well, one thing you can do is include a value claim in your premise set. The question then is, well, aren't you just starting with opinions? Maybe, we'll see. Here's an example of an argument. Sorry about the silliness of it. All dogs are fish. All fish are dead. Therefore, all dogs are dead. That's a valid argument. If you grant me the premises, and you won't, you are obliged on pain of irrationality to grant me the conclusion. Here's another argument. All dogs are fish. All fish are good. Therefore, all dogs are good. That also is a valid argument. If you buy the premises, you got to buy the conclusion. We're not going to buy the premises. On the other hand, if he can get you to agree with the premises, then he's got something. And here's a premise that he starts with. Starving to death is really bad. He thinks you will agree with this. In fact, he says something. He says, I suppose there are people out there who won't grant me that premise. And then he says, well, I'm not talking to you. I got plenty of people I think I am talking to. I'll talk to them. I'm not talking to those other people. talking to all but the sociopaths, all but 4% of us. So that's what he says. So he's not going to do anything more about getting you to buy into that value premise. One complaint people have with his argument is that he's committing a certain fallacy here, a fallacy called poisoning the well. Basically, if you don't agree with my premise, you're a terrible person and a sociopath. And nobody wants to be a terrible person and a sociopath, so I'm not even going to, I can't even think about rejecting that premise, otherwise that's called poisoning the well. But I don't think he's doing that. He's just honestly saying, okay, you don't want to, I'm just not talking to you. I'm not casting aspersions on you here. So now we got another premise. And again, this is going to be another value premise. And this is, well, here it is. You ought to prevent really bad things from happening if you can do so without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. Put those two together, it's not going to take too much to get to the conclusion. You need to be giving away a lot more than you give to start over in South State and elsewhere. Now, there's also a weaker version of that premise, which would support a weaker conclusion. A weaker premise is going to support a weaker conclusion. And instead of saying without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, which could require quite a substantial sacrifice, given the importance of 2.2 million people starving maybe. He's saying, well, we'll give a weaker one, maybe you can weasel out of some of your obligations this way without sacrificing anything morally significant. But I think white shirts and neckties still fall under that. Now, it's possible that this is more of an abstract thing. It's possible that a person won't agree with this one. So maybe he needs an argument for this premise to get people on board. He's not going to give an argument for the first premise. Maybe he needs an argument for this one. So this is how his argument is structured, and he goes on to say, okay, consider a case. And those of you who have read this, he gives us like a 2-sentence case. There's this imagined case. There's this little kid out in a shallow pond, fall down, hurt his head, he's drowning. No big deal for you, it's a big deal for him. And you can prevent this little kid from starving to death. You can prevent this little kid from drowning at minimal cost to yourself. The cost to yourself in the article is you just went to Nordstrom and bought a $200 pair of shoes, which is what they cost at Nordstrom, and a $250 pair of jeans, which is what they cost at Nordstrom. So you're talking $450. That's a lot of money. And if you really need to, convince yourself of the argument of the scenario, say, look, you got a glassy, broken glass on the bottom, so you got to keep your shoes on, and you got, something's going to cut your legs up, so you got to keep your pants on, whatever. But you got to make that sacrifice. Clearly, we all agree. Value judgment here. Yeah, you got to go ahead and save the kid on pain of immorality. What if you don't agree? Well, I guess I'm not talking. Now, we might go on to wonder, why is it that we have this obligation to save the little kid from drowning? Well, one way of responding is to come up with a moral theory. That's not what Singer does. He says, I don't want to rescue my utilitarianism. Maybe we'll try to figure out, he doesn't quite put it this way, but I think this is what's going on. He says, well, let's just think of what explanatory principle, what general moral principle would explain this particular moral obligation. And what might that be? Well, here's a candidate. You ought to prevent really bad things from happening, and you can do so without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance or anything morally significant. That's one way of going about it. There's another way you can think of it. You can think of it as an argument from analogy, refraining from saving the child in the pond is seriously morally wrong. Refraining from helping these starving people is morally on a par with refraining from helping these kids. Actually, we do need to talk about this. Is morally on a par, or is an analogous case to refraining from helping starving people. Or refraining from helping starving people is morally analogous to refraining from helping a little kid. Well, what's true in the case of the little kid, that is true in this other case too. This is on an analogy. Okay? The trouble with analogies is they depend upon relevant similarities between cases and the lack of, or not the lack of, that's a negative thing, the absence of relevant dissimilarities. So, Singer, he's working his way so far, he's up through a few paragraphs. He's got a 31 paragraph article, he's up through about paragraph, I don't know, 8-ish or so. He says, okay, well, here are some possible disanalogies that a person might adduce, or a person might adduce, right? Yeah, a person might adduce, put forward. Number one, the child in the pond is right in front of you. You're naturally going to feel your obligation here. The kids in South Sudan are on the other side of the world. You don't have that. They're on the other. They're out of sight and out of mind. So you're just not going to feel this obligation. That's one disanalogy. The other one is, this kid in the pond is right here. It's pretty easy to do what you need to do to accomplish your moral, to fulfill your moral obligations. It's pretty hard to reach around the other side of the world and make good things happen over there. So what are we going to? How is Singer going to respond to those claimed disanalogies between cases? One, out of sight, out of mind is neither here nor there. I'm not talking about psychological facts. I'm talking about your moral obligations. Just because you don't feel your moral obligations doesn't mean they're there. Doesn't mean they're not there. You're still, obliged to do it. I don't care whether you got a personal connection or not. By the way, I can't help but indulging myself in trying with patients. I actually have a connection to South Sudan and to Malakal, where that actually happened. My brother's a carpenter and a contractor and a trapper up in Alaska, and he spends 2 months of every year around in the wintertime when it's cold in Alaska, in South Sudan, building a clinic about 45 miles southwest of Malakal for a doctor who's done a lot of work on research on that Kala-Azar epidemic. So I actually have kind of this connection, and I've given given some support to this pretty small time charity, mainly because of the psychological fact, not because it's, I suppose, the sort of acting out of a moral obligation the way some things I should. For what it's worth. Anyway, Singer says, I'm not talking about what people are in fact disposed to do. I'm not describing the world. I'm making action guiding statements. I'm making normative statements, not descriptive statements. The world's not in charge. I'm in charge. I'm telling you how to change the world. Whatever the psychological realities are. As far as being impractical to reach your arms all the way around the world, we live in a global village. You get on a plane and you're there. Or you go online, punch a button, and World Vision, they're a Christian organization, Heifer International, those are both highly rated charities. You can be pretty darn sure that your money's good. Well, you can be very, very sure as far as I know that your money is going to be doing good stuff. And in fact, to the degree I'm not sure, all I got to do is go to Charity Navigator, one of those websites where they're rated. There's ways to make it pretty easy for you to reach your arm around. So Singer's not impressed by those objections. Those are not disanalogies, he says. Well, here's another objection. And interestingly, obviously, I do my part, but I don't do what Singer thinks I should do. In fact, if everybody did what I do, we wouldn't have any trouble. And that's the next thing what Singer thinks about. Here's a response. Look, if everybody gave, he says 5 pounds, everybody gives $10 to famine relief, the problems will be solved. Well, my obligations are just like everybody else's. So, my obligations are to give $10. And that's, I don't know if you got the handout, my handout, you've got my handout, I've got somewhere, on that one, the other side, I guess. No, there it is. Yeah, that one. Big paragraph from Singer. That's paragraph 10 out of his article, and then my version. Singer says, if you were to take time to read that through, we don't have time now, I don't think, that what I have just done in giving my excuses for just giving $10 is I have started with a hypothetical premise, or a premise that's a hypothetical, and I have drawn I guess he says non-hypothetical, a categorical conclusion from it. And then here's an example of an argument, a counterexample to that argument form. The point about a counterexample to an argument form is that you see how stupid it is. If I'm 10 feet tall, I'm taller than 9 feet tall. There's my hypothetical premise, if then. If I'm 10 feet tall, I'm taller than 9 feet tall. 9 feet is identical, or 9 is identical to 3 times 3. Therefore, I'm taller than 3 times 3. If everybody gives famine relief, my share is $10. My share is equal to everybody else's share. Therefore, my share is $10. It depends on this hypothetical of everybody giving the famine relief. But everybody ain't giving the famine relief. So that argument, the conclusion doesn't follow from that argument. Just like the conclusion didn't follow from the 9 feet tall or 3 times 3 foot tall argument. That went by very quickly, but that's what he's getting at in that. What he's doing there is just some straight logic. It has nothing to do with values, but he's using a counterexample. Well, I'm using a counterexample, showing that there's a logical fallacy in the way the excuse is supposed to work. I don't want excuses, not a plea for them. I said, I'm not doing what Singer wants us all to do. He wants me to do the fact that not everybody's going to give $10. And so he's got that argument with that particular case. But in general, notice that he's got this argument and he's considering objections. And these are actual objections that I'm inclined to try to run. Why? Because I don't like the conclusion so much. I like having a big screen TV to watch the World Series on. Even though I'm officially on strike against professional sports, but once the series comes, what can you do? So I want to keep that, and I kind of can't in good conscience. Okay, is there any way to resist the conclusion? Well, I'll just keep throwing up objections. That's called, that's not honest, rational thinking. That's rationalizing. I've got a conclusion that I want to hang on to wherever it came from, and I'm going to rationalize it. I'm going to make it rational by making sense of it by giving arguments. But it's the position that's running the show, not the arguments. If the arguments, if rational thinking, I draw my conclusions on the basis of the arguments. Well, that ain't what I'm doing. I've got this conclusion I'm going to hold to, so I'm just casting them out for arguments. This one's bad, okay, I'll find another one. Okay, I'll find another one. We do that all the time. And when all is said and done, with the Singer, I got one that I think works, but so we'll leave. There's another one in paragraphs 11 and 12. Harvey?
Here, sorry. I'll read it.
Okay. In paragraphs 11 and 12, oh, here we go again. In paragraphs 11 and 12, there's something interesting, sort of subtle point. We'll leave that for now. First, a couple more objections to consider. But first, a point that the singer thinks is important to make. We all agree, I think, not certain, Ayn Rand does not agree. And she thinks she's got a philosophical theory that justifies her not agreeing. And it's ethical egoism, but you people it's possible to act in other people's interests, and you people who do it are acting immorally. And she's got a story to tell. I don't like her story, but she's got one, and it's worth at least being a product, or at least finding out about. But for most of us, if somebody, Albert Schweitzer, I think he's Germany, he's a medical missionary to Southern Africa somewhere, I forget where. Good on you, Albert. That's a good thing to do. Very, very admirable thing. Way above and beyond the call of duty, but a very admirable thing. We could call it charity in some of our standard ways of thinking. And, that's great. But, I can't be blamed for not being like Albert Schweitzer. The singer says, yes, you can. More or less. We need to rejigger or rethink our categories of charity and obligation. Doing what Singer says we should do is not a matter of going above and beyond the call of duty. Supererogation. It's not a supererogatory act. It's not an act above and beyond the call of duty. It is your duty. So the sphere of duties and obligations, such that we're blameworthy if we do not fulfill them, is vastly expanded. And Singer says, yeah, it's vastly expanded. It's a wholesale change of our moral scheme, he calls it. By the way, who enforces morals? Or who enforces rationality? You must, if you believe these premises and I got a good argument, you must believe the conclusion on pain of irrationality. Who enforces who enforces the pain of irrationality? It's just a manner of speaking. If you want to be irrational, what can I do? If you want to be immoral, Singer's not going to bring the government to bear. He's not going to come following you around with a stick. You're just being immoral. He's just pointing that out to you. He's saying that somebody's going to enforce it. He's not a totalitarian. I don't want to use the word conscience. I don't like that word so much. Now we get into my moral theory, so but something that's between you and your conscience. Nobody punishes you if you're immoral. You just shouldn't be immoral. Okay, and now Singer signals that he thinks he needs to consider two more objections. We just talked about the need for a gigantic revision of our moral scheme. And one thing you might say is, well, that's just unrealistic. It ain't going to happen. In our moral scheme, it's not charity to refrain from stealing. That's an obligation. But charity, acts of charity are acts of charity. Giving to starving people, that is charity. And, well, Singer says, well, no, I just said it's an obligation. It's not charity. What you can say there is, look, I got an argument. I gave you an argument. What you're saying is you don't like my conclusion about the sphere of obligation. You got to do better than that. You can't just say you don't like it. I had an argument with starting points that you agreed to, and I argued to it with good logical inferences. don't like my conclusion? Tell me what's wrong with my inferences. Because you already agreed to the premises. That's one thing he said. If you can't do that, if you're not going to take back the premises, if you're not going to point out mistakes in the logic, you're, on pain of irrationality, forced to accept the conclusion. Another response to this claim that we can't revise our moral scheme that much. He will consider another objection having to do with the facts about the genesis or the development of our moral scheme, the one we have. Important philosopher named John Emerson. John? J.L. No. J.L. Anyway, Emerson, I think it's John, says morality is the system of rules that we have found necessary to have a functioning society. It grounds the possibility of social living. We're going to all live together, and human beings pretty much got to. We need some accommodations for each other so that we can make all this possible. The obligations of the moral schemes that exist that came about for these reasons extend to things like stealing or murder. You can't do those things because we can't have a social order if we allow those things. But that's as far as they extend. They don't extend to these notions that we actually do call charity. They just don't extend that far because that sort of thing is not necessary to ground the social order, the possibilities of human social living. Singer's response to that is the response in his article. I'm going to add to it just a little bit. The response in the article is, again, you're talking facts. You're talking about what our moral scheme is and how it got started. I'm talking about what ought to be the case. And I've got this argument. You agree with the premises. I've got a pretty good chain of reasoning. You've got to accept the conclusion. You can't weasel out of it that way by pointing out something about the origins of our moral scheme. Just a second, Mark. I have one more thing to say. Actually, I'll mention it and then let you in on it. Another thing he could say, he doesn't say this explicitly, is I think maybe Emerson is committing the genetic fallacy. Just because something came to arise in a certain circumstance, and you can explain the origins and development of it, doesn't mean that that's what it is in the present day. One other point that Singer makes that might to have some resonance given these concerns. Another response by someone who wants to resist Singer's claims about the vast expanse of our moral obligations. Here you say, look, morality, if we were all angels, there would be no morality. So morality is not for angels, and it's not for devils either. It's for human beings. Now, your morality is a morality for angels. We're just not built that way. We can't do that. It's beyond our capacity to be that good. So we got to have a more reasonable standard of what's required of us. Otherwise, we'll despair of our moral character in total, and then we will, kind of like what I do, is say, oh, well, forget it, I can't be moral, so I'm not going to beat myself up about it. To that, Singer has this to say. That's an empirical claim. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We should investigate. Will people actually lose concern with their moral character if they have a high standard to live up to? Another thing is, maybe we can make some progress in our moral character by having these high standards. Maybe it's worthwhile trying. And if we're going to make empirical claims, this seems like a plausible one. Last thing I got to say, because we got to wrap this up, says Alex. It seems a plausible empirical claim to to say that people are influenced by the behaviors of their fellows and the schemes of the societies they live in. So if you, and then the next person, and the next person starts acting in a better way, other people are going to act in a better way. And if everybody starts, or a number of people start acting according to these wider obligations, wider set of obligations, it's not going to be as onerous. It's not going to be as tough to do. Even flawed human beings like us, maybe, possible electrical claim, we're going to be develop our capacities to meet those higher demands. You're in the sermon.